Today, I want to talk about failure. Specifically, how one man's failure to achieve his dream led to his eventual masterpiece. Our story starts with a kid named John. He was born in 1892 in South Africa. But by the time he was 12 years old, both his mother and father had died, leaving him and his brother orphans. The two of them were sent to live under the care of a Catholic priest in England, a place where they had never lived before. As John got older, his interest in fairy tales did not fade. If anything, he became more interested in them. He also developed a keen interest for languages, and he started inventing some of his own, just for fun. Eventually, John would undertake a course of study at Oxford University, where his interest in languages led to a course of study in English literature. He and some of his undergraduate friends, brought together by their similar interests, even formed a kind of literary club. But everything changed for John when he and the rest of his generation were called to war. A quick side note here, you've got to understand that World War I was war like nobody had ever seen it before. It came at a time when the tactics of war had not yet caught up to the innovations of war. We're talking about innovations like the machine gun, the flamethrower, chemical warfare, the tank. And these innovations, they did not develop evenly. At a time where some countries were sending cavalrymen out onto the battlefield riding horses, the same battlefields were being strafed by machine gun fire from planes. For the first time, the act of killing was mechanized and highly efficient. Battles were still being fought using a lot of traditional tactics, like armies lining up in neat rows and marching out together to meet each other on the battlefield, only to get completely mowed down in a couple bursts of machine gun fire. There are these accounts of German machine gunners refusing to fire on retreating British soldiers just out of pure pity for what they were seeing. This was the war that John stood up and volunteered to serve in. John served as a second lieutenant in the war, and his unit was at the Battle of the Somme, an offensive between the forces of England, Germany, and France. When you think of trench warfare with shells flying overhead in these muddy trenches, the Battle of the Somme is what you're picturing. Out of the 3 million men who were at the Battle of the Somme, an estimated 1 million were either injured or killed, making it, to this day, one of the bloodiest and deadliest battles in all of human history. John's unit was almost completely wiped out at the Battle of the Somme, and he might have been among the casualties had he not come down with a serious case of trench fever just a few days before the worst of the fighting started. This caused him to be transferred home. Luckily, by the time the war was over, almost all of John's close friends were dead, including most of the members of his literary club from his undergraduate days. John liked to write, and he kept up writing even during the war. He had started work on something that he was calling the Book of Lost Tales. It was a sort of collection of short stories. In it, his early love of fairy tales was combined with a new appreciation for a recently published Finnish book of mythology known as the Kalevala. One of the stories in the Book of Lost Tales, The Fall of Gondolin, features this race of elves who are making their last stand against an invading force. Ultimately, they are defeated. As John would later write, a real taste for fairy stories was wakened by philology on the threshold of manhood and quickened to full life by war. Overall, the Lost Tales read a lot more like fictional history than they do short stories or novels. Those who read them found them striking, if a little odd. Recurring illness kept John out of the rest of the war. Afterward, John began an academic career, eventually taking a position as professor of Anglo-Saxon at Oxford University. For a time, he actually worked as one of the writers of the Oxford English Dictionary, and he translated some Middle English works like Sir Gawain and the Green Knight and Beowulf. But all the while, he was working on his own fiction, too. Inspired by fairy tales, the Kalevala, and Anglo-Saxon literature, John began to write what he conceived of as a fictional mythology for England. The concept was that this story he was writing was actually a translation of lost texts that had been recovered from before history. It was a story that told of a sunken continent, elves, a creator god, a whole pantheon of angelic beings, and even his own invented languages. Now, you might assume that somebody with John's academic background and connections wouldn't have any problem getting his work published. That didn't turn out to be the case. John's work was super imaginative, very sweeping, super deep, and also very dense. John had a few early successes in getting some of his fiction published, but when it came to trying to sell his wider, overarching narrative, his fictional mythology, nobody was interested. The answer was always the same. It was too grandiose, too dry. There was no market for it. For decades, John continued to work on his fictional mythology in his free time. There are literally boxes and boxes of handwritten papers from this period of his life. One kind of cool thing about this is that much of it was written during World War II, when there was strict paper rationing in effect. So some of his work is written on the backs of old scratch paper. Other times you can see he took papers he had written on and erased them entirely from top to bottom so that he could reuse them, just to salvage some writing space. And for decades, hardly anybody saw any of his work, other than his wife Edith and a small group of personal friends that he met with weekly at a pub in Oxford. Well, that and his 4 children. See, aside from his great mythology, John had also started creating a series of bedtime stories for his children, just for fun. These were stories that he would just make up on the fly at bedtime, and they were a lot like the fairy tales and imaginative adventures that he had really enjoyed as a child. Then one day, John, now better known by his academic title Professor Tolkien, was grading exam papers. It was a process that he described as laborious and boring. In the middle of his work, he picked up the next page to be graded out of this huge stack of essays and found that this page, for whatever reason, had been left completely blank. In Professor Tolkien's own words, glorious, nothing to read. So I scribbled on it, I can't think why. In a hole in the ground, there lived a hobbit. Professor Tolkien's spontaneous idea for a creature called a hobbit became the inspiration for a new bedtime story for his kids. Tolkien made up a story for his kids about a funny little fellow named Bilbo Baggins, who gets recruited by a wizard to steal treasure from a dragon. As the story expanded, Tolkien started to have a little bit of trouble remembering it all. So when his children started correcting him on some of the details of his own story, he knew he needed to start writing it down. Before long, he had a lengthy narrative with a beginning, middle, and end. Tolkien suddenly had a children's book on his hands. As John Garth writes in Tolkien and the Great War, At the Threshold of Middle-earth, Tolkien had started writing stories for their children as early as 1920, when he first sent John a letter purporting to be from Father Christmas. That year, Edith had a second son, Michael, and in 1924, a third, Christopher. In 1929, a daughter, Priscilla, was born. It was for their entertainment that he wrote The Hobbit, showing it to an enthusiastic C.S. Lewis in 1933. Side note, I'm never surprised when somebody tells me that they tried to read The Hobbit and then just couldn't get into it. It is really unlike a modern fantasy novel. In the earlier chapters, it's really episodic in nature, with a series of self-contained little misadventures. Almost like someone was trying to come up with quick, digestible stories to get their kids to go to sleep. The problem was, Tolkien wasn't a children's writer. Not in his mind, anyway. The epic, sprawling mythologies that he created on his own time used really esoteric, grandiose sort of language. He was telling tales of war and valor and romance and tragedy, like lots of tragedy. It was all very serious, and frankly, pretty difficult to read. His biggest problem was that his work just really wasn't accessible to anybody outside of an academic audience. Compare that to the stories he was telling his children. Those he filled with silliness, jokes, riddles, songs, and he was getting feedback from his kids in real time as he was telling the stories. So he knew which parts to keep because they were engaging, and which parts didn't really hold their interest. He was doing his best to keep his kids engaged with thrills and scares and laughs. The story was still epic and huge in scale and full of adventure, but it was also pretty lighthearted and, well, entertaining. Frankly, it was just plain fun. Plus, the main character was kind of kid-like. He wasn't really a great warrior, he didn't really know what he was doing, he was totally unprepared for the quest he was on. Throughout this whole adventure, all he really wanted to do was go home and eat. Sounds like some kids I know. Yet eventually, Bilbo becomes a greater hero than anybody else in the story. This more approachable style is what led to The Hobbit, a new kind of fairy tale book for children, being published in 1937. And just like that, J.R.R. Tolkien suddenly became a household name. But this is where the story starts to get interesting. All the time that Tolkien was writing The Hobbit and becoming a huge success, he still hadn't given up on his original idea, his grand mythology. By now it had a name, the Silmarillion. To Tolkien, children's books were all well and good, but the Silmarillion was his real passion. And since The Hobbit was now this huge bestseller, surely he would be able to publish the Silmarillion now and share his vision with the world. Nope. Tolkien was met with nothing but rejection. Not even the wild success of The Hobbit was enough to convince publishers to take a chance on his dense mythology filled with battles and lore and legends and elves. They didn't want all that, but what they did want was a sequel to The Hobbit. Even after all of that runaway success, he still couldn't get anybody to take a chance on his big passion project. At this point, The Hobbit was so huge that anything with Tolkien's name on it would have sold. They must have really not been interested. That's what you call failure. Tolkien was understandably pretty discouraged. In letters to his friends and colleagues, it's clear that while he appreciated The Hobbit for what it was, he considered it distinct and entirely separate from his more serious work. In one letter in 1937, he even wrote, "I don't much approve of The Hobbit myself, preferring my own mythology." Readers and publishers wanted more Hobbits. And as far as Tolkien was concerned, the Silmarillion was no place for Hobbits. It seemed like this thing that Tolkien had been working on for decades was just destined to never see the light of day. Reluctantly and half-heartedly, Tolkien took up his pen and started working on a sequel to The Hobbit. There were many false starts. There appear to be many places where he started, got discouraged along the way, and abandoned work on it for long periods of time entirely. At one point in 1938, he wrote, "The Hobbit sequel is still where it was, and I have only the vaguest notions of how to proceed, not ever intending any sequel. I fear I squandered all my favorite motifs and characters on the original Hobbit." But then, J.R.R. Tolkien made a decision that would change the entire landscape of literature forever. He decided, they want Hobbits? Alright, I'll give them Hobbits. The Hobbit sequel, as it was initially referred to, began to take on a very different form. Soon it was no longer just a simple sequel. It grew more and more expansive the more he wrote it, and sometimes he described it as if he was discovering it along the way. In a letter on June 7, 1955, he wrote, "I met a lot of things on the way that astonished me. Tom Bombadil I knew already, but I had never been to Bree. Strider sitting in the corner at the inn was a shock, and I had no more idea who he was than had Frodo. The Mines of Moria had been a mere name, and of Lothlorien no word had reached my mortal ears till I came there. Far away I knew there were the Horse Lords, on the confines of an ancient kingdom of men. But Fangorn Forest was an unforeseen adventure. I had never heard of the House of Eorl, nor of the Stewards of Gondor. Most disquieting of all, Saruman had never been revealed to me, and I was as mystified as Frodo at Gandalf's failure to appear on September 22nd. Tolkien wrote and wrote, and he rewrote and rewrote. Like, I really can't stress the rewriting part enough. A huge amount of his work exists in multiple versions, especially the earlier chapters, which are written in careful longhand in some places, and in barely comprehensible scribbles in others. He would write a chapter, set it aside, return to it, make notes in the margins, rewrite it, decide he wanted to change something about it, then write it all over again from scratch, beginning to end, several times. The original papers still exist with all these many different versions of his early chapters on them. In fact, in February of 1938, he wrote, "They say it is the first step that costs the effort. I do not find it so. I am sure I could write unlimited first chapters. I have indeed written many." When all was said and done, it had taken Tolkien 12 years to write his Hobbit sequel, and the final result was not the single-volume children's book his publishers had been expecting. Instead, Tolkien presented them with a quest that spanned 6 books. After some pushback from the publishers and a whole lot of editing, these 6 books got trimmed down to 3. But it was still a heck of a long story. He had given them hobbits all right, but these hobbits were now mixed up in a much bigger story in a much wider world. And a seemingly unimportant item from The Hobbit as a plot device to connect the two, a magic ring that Bilbo had stumbled upon inside of a cave, he tied the 2 stories together, creating an epic quest for his protagonists that placed the fate of the entire world in their little hands. The rest, of course, is history. The 3 volumes of the Hobbit sequel, which would collectively be titled The Lord of the Rings, published between 1954 and 1955, basically invented the modern fantasy genre. The Lord of the Rings would eventually go on to sell over 150 million copies worldwide, making them the best-selling novels of the 20th century. In fact, only one book outsold them in that time: the Bible. Can we just pause for a moment to truly appreciate what we've just discovered? Because even after reading about all of this and studying Tolkien's work, this still blows me away. The Hobbit was never supposed to be a part of the Lord of the Rings world. They were supposed to exist in 2 separate, unconnected universes. Don't believe me? Here it is in Tolkien's own words. The following is from a letter written by J.R.R. Tolkien in July of 1964. I returned to Oxford in January 1926, and by the time The Hobbit appeared, 1937, this matter of the elder days, the Silmarillion, was in coherent form. The Hobbit was not intended to have anything to do with it. I had the habit, while my children were still young, of inventing and telling, sometimes of writing down, children's stories for their private amusement. The Hobbit was intended to be one of them. It had no necessary connection with the mythology. Even though Tolkien had created this huge world with its own mythology and history and languages, it was not his intention that The Hobbit was going to be a part of that world. But no one would give his greater work a chance, so he improvised. Tolkien crammed The Hobbit into the world of Middle-earth like a puzzle piece jammed smack in the center, and he adjusted his existing plan to fit everything else around it. Basically, if that was what it was going to take to tell his story, that was what he was going to do. Did Tolkien have to do this? No. Could he have just kept plugging away on the Silmarillion, refusing to compromise on his artistic vision? Sure. But if he had, The Lord of the Rings, some of the highest-selling books of all time, the precursor to the fantasy genre, never would have happened. Once you realize that The Hobbit was never actually intended to be part of the Lord of the Rings world, you can start to see evidence of it everywhere. Gandalf is a wizard in The Hobbit. Well, this presented a bit of a problem. There were never intended to be wizards in Tolkien's mythology. Wizards were for kids' stories. To fix this, the word wizard became something that the simpler folk of Middle-earth called the type of being that Gandalf actually was, which you can look up for yourself if you want. It's pretty interesting. And how about dwarves? To me, the difference between the dwarves of The Hobbit and Gimli in The Lord of the Rings has always been such a huge disconnect. In fact, the Peter Jackson Hobbit films, they really had to make some changes to the dwarves, just for sake of consistency, to make them a bit more like Gimli. The dwarves in the book, on the other hand, in The Hobbit, are comically inept. Seriously, they have no idea what they're doing. They keep getting in trouble at every turn, they're almost eaten, they get lost, they get captured a few times. At the start of the book, they don't even have weapons. They have no swords, nothing. Compare that to Gimli in The Lord of the Rings, who's this one dwarf army. He's just mowing down orcs with his axe, keeping a tally of all his kills. This difference between the dwarves in The Hobbit and Gimli always seemed kind of odd to me. Well, now we know why. Originally, these were 2 separate universes, with 2 very different ideas of what the essential qualities of dwarves were. As much as it hurts me to say this, I'm just going to say it. There are some major world-building inconsistencies between The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. Some of the stuff that is mentioned in the Shire is like several hundred years ahead of the rest of Middle-earth. Tolkien even said at one point that the Shire was supposed to be a typical rural English village around the time of the Queen's Diamond Jubilee. If you look into this, that would put it around the time of Victorian England. I mean, hobbits use umbrellas, and there's references to them having indoor plumbing. And to top it off, The Hobbit makes a reference to the game of golf being invented. Whereas in Lord of the Rings, you get these kingdoms of Rohan and Gondor, which feel way more like Anglo-Saxon England pre-1066. These differences can be really jarring at times, and this was not an oversight on Tolkien's part. He knew that there were problems. At one point, he had actually planned to go back and revise The Hobbit and kind of rewrite it to give it a tone and style that were a little bit more like The Lord of the Rings and fix some of the inconsistencies and issues. But he never did, so the inconsistencies remain as the legacy. And this is just one of the reasons that Tolkien, for all his life, considered his work to be woefully flawed and ultimately incomplete. Tolkien wrote in his foreword to the second edition of the Fellowship of the Ring, "The most critical reader of all, myself, now finds many defects, minor and major. But being fortunately under no obligation either to review the book or to write it again, he will pass over these in silence, except one that has been noted by others. The book is too short." As with everything that Tolkien did, there was a story behind the story. His original idea of presenting a mythology as if it had been recovered from lost texts from a prehistorical world, he ran with it. If you check the appendices of The Lord of the Rings, you'll see that every main character has a family tree that dates their lineage back several generations. But Tolkien even had a family tree in mind for his imaginary translation that he supposedly used to tell his story. I mean, it's incredible. Tolkien framed The Lord of the Rings as The Hobbit's memoirs. I'll defer to fantasy literature scholar Demetra Feeney. The supposed source for The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings is the Red Book of Westmarch. Tolkien described the textual transmission of the Red Book of Westmarch as follows. First, the original manuscript included Bilbo's private diary, so the story of The Hobbit. Frodo's account of the War of the Ring compiled by Sam, so the story of The Lord of the Rings. Bilbo's translations from Elvish sources in Rivendell, and Hobbit lore collected in the Shire. Then we're told the Red Book was copied by scribes in Minas Tirith after the War of the Ring. When they copied it, they also included annotations and corrections and added parts of the tale of Aragorn and Arwen, a story that is told in the appendices of The Lord of the Rings. A copy of this particular augmented compilation was then made in Minas Tirith and brought back to the Shire, where the hobbits added marginalia, scribbles on the margins. This, claims Tolkien, is the source that he used for The Hobbit, The Lord of the Rings, as well as his later poetry collection, The Adventures of Tom Bombadil, tellingly subtitled, "And Other Verses from the Red Book." That is a lot to take in, and it's why when people say that Tolkien's work is unlike anything else ever written, they're not just saying that. He was extremely detailed, he was a perfectionist, and he thought of everything. Unfortunately, this is where the story starts to get a little sad. Tolkien's real work, the thing he had dreamed of sharing with the world, he never did complete it. It remained unpublished in his lifetime. As for the reason for this, according to Demetra Feeney, Tolkien's turn from writing a mythology to writing fantasy novels from the late 1920s onwards transformed his invented world and created an additional layer of complexity in his already many times revised legendarium. He tried, he really did, to revise the earlier mythology so that it could now be consistent and integrated with The Lord of the Rings. But the vision had changed too much. As Christopher Tolkien once noted, it was not that his father could not finish the Silmarillion. What he could not finish was the post-Lord of the Rings Silmarillion. He could not satisfactorily integrate the two different visions of his world, the mythological, the bigger picture and vision of a large canvas, and the novelistic, with its minute details and specifics. When Christopher Tolkien eventually edited the Silmarillion, he selected versions of the main stories, some from earlier periods, in which case he had to regularize things. So what's really at the core of this story? Is Tolkien a genius for imaginatively reframing his work? Or did he compromise on his artistic vision? Was he a sellout? How do we reconcile these two ideas? Here's the thing about the Silmarillion. Tolkien considered it to be his great life's work. He loved it. Nobody else did. Meanwhile, The Hobbit unexpectedly became this runaway success. So over here was the thing that he loved that nobody wanted, and over here was the thing that everybody wanted, but he didn't really love that much. Sure, Tolkien could have stuck to his guns and refused to compromise on his vision, but instead, his creative adaptability ended up turning his failure into a massive success. Tolkien never did finish the Silmarillion, but his son Christopher made it his life's mission to finish it for him, which he did. J.R.R. Tolkien's true life's work was published in 1977, a few years after his death. And do you know the biggest complaints that people have about the Silmarillion? It is dry, grandiose, and difficult to read. I'm going to again defer to Demetra Feeney. She says, "I think what Tolkien was planning, but he didn't live long enough to do it, was to present the Silmarillion, when he would finish it at last, as the bit from the Red Book that is unaccounted for, Bilbo's translation from Elvish material in Rivendell." Christopher Tolkien published the Silmarillion neat. When you open the Silmarillion, it begins as if you're reading the Bible of the elves, with the Godhead creating the vision of the world. But towards the end of The Lord of the Rings, Bilbo gives Frodo 3 books of lore that he had made at various times, written in his spidery hand and labeled on the red backs, translations from the Elvish by B.B. These 3 books were surely meant to be the framework by which the Silmarillion could have been presented, and that framework perhaps would have made the book more accessible, less obscure, less difficult. In fact, Christopher Tolkien later wrote that he was almost certain that was the case, but he had been reluctant to add this framework himself when his father had never managed to do so. Now, all that said, if you ever manage to read the Silmarillion, you may notice something rather interesting. Despite the fact that the Silmarillion is basically Tolkien's Bible for his fantasy world, including the account of the creation of the universe, thousands of years worth of history, the origins of all the species, including humans, elves, dwarves, orcs, and others, something is missing. Can you guess what it is? Hobbits. There is not one hobbit in the Silmarillion. There is not even one mention of hobbits in the Silmarillion. You will not find one in the entire text. There is nothing to explain what hobbits are, where they come from, how they're related to other species in the world, how they fit into the history. Not a thing about them. And now you know why. Because hobbits were uninvited guests at an unexpected party. Personally, on the question of whether Tolkien was a genius for reframing his work or if he compromised on his artistic vision, I tend to fall in the first category. Partly because I'm just a huge fan of his work. The Fellowship of the Ring is my favorite book. I've read it a bunch of times. I've even read the dry, grandiose Silmarillion multiple times. But mostly it's because I believe that art requires 2 parties, the creator and the audience. Art that is purely for the enjoyment of the artist, that's a great thing. But if you want an audience, which many creators do, then you might have to be willing to take some feedback and revise your vision. That's just what Tolkien did. And I'd say it paid off because, here's the thing, hobbits are what make The Lord of the Rings work. Think about it, Frodo, Sam, Merry, and Pippin, they really are like uninvited guests in Tolkien's wider mythology. It's this juxtaposition between a sprawling, epic world full of heroes and history and legends and magic, and a viewpoint that's seen from the eyes of a few outsiders, literal outsiders. They were never meant to be in the story to begin with, that gives The Lord of the Rings some of its essential qualities. Yes, we feel lost in this huge world and totally out of our element, and so do the main characters. We can relate to the lost, hapless hobbits more than we can relate to any other characters in the story. Without this dynamic to sort of anchor the entire story, it just wouldn't feel quite the same. So I guess the question is, Was Tolkien's inability to get his great masterpiece published in his lifetime a failure? Well, I don't know. I think it was a setback, certainly. Much the same way that a case of trench fever was a setback, that just so happened to pull Tolkien from the front lines just a few days before he might have been killed in one of the deadliest battles ever fought. How about you? Will you be defined by your failures, or will it be your ability to adapt to them and revise in the face of rejection that leads to your true masterpiece? A special thanks to my Patreon patrons who help make it possible for me to continue to create my books and my blog and my video content and everything else I've got my hands in. Also, thank you to the following sources: John Garth's Tolkien and the Great War at the Threshold of Middle-earth, Dimitra Feeney's series of lectures from the Great Courses entitled The World of J.R.R. Tolkien. I also drew from Tolkien's own words from his essay called On Fairy Stories. Thank you to Corey Olson, aka the Tolkien Professor, who makes his lectures available as a podcast. And most of all, the unbelievable scholarship of Christopher Tolkien and his 12-volume series entitled The History of Middle-earth.